Nobody expected a letter about Greenland to end up sparking a constitutional crisis, but here America is. President Donald Trump sent a message to Norway's prime minister that stopped the entire political world in its tracks. In that letter, Trump demanded complete and total control of Greenland. And then, in words that nobody in Washington was prepared for, he wrote that because Norway did not give him the Nobel Peace Prize, he no longer felt any obligation to think purely of peace. Read that again. The President of the United States told a foreign leader that peace was no longer his priority. Within hours, the reaction was explosive, not just from Democrats, not just from foreign governments, from doctors, from former military officials, from people who have spent their entire careers studying how the American presidency works. The phones lit up, the social media posts came flooding in, and the word that kept appearing over and over again was the same word that has the entire political establishment holding its breath right now, the 25th Amendment. That is the part of the American Constitution that allows a sitting president to be removed from office if he is deemed unfit to carry out his duties. It has never been used to remove a president in the entire history of the United States. Not once. And yet right now, in January of 2026, multiple members of Congress are standing in front of cameras and microphones and demanding that it be invoked immediately against Donald Trump. One congresswoman called the President of the United States directly and publicly extremely mentally ill. A senator reduced his entire message to 3 words: invoke the 25th Amendment. Another representative said Trump is unfit to lead and clearly out of control. This is not backroom whisper. This is elected officials on record saying that the man currently sitting in the most powerful seat on earth should be removed from that seat right now. Stay right here, because the details of what triggered all of this, what the Constitution actually allows, and what could realistically happen next is a story that every person needs to understand. Subscribe to this channel because this one is moving fast. The letter that started all of this did not come from nowhere. To understand why Washington exploded the way it did, it is important to understand what has been building underneath the surface for weeks. Because this was not one isolated moment. This was the moment that broke the dam on a conversation that many people in power have been having privately for a very long time. Since returning to the White House, President Trump has made a series of moves that have raised eyebrows across the political spectrum. The push for Greenland has been loud and persistent. Trump has spoken about acquiring the Danish territory multiple times, framing it as a national security necessity. Denmark has said no. Greenland's own leaders have said no. International law makes it clear that sovereign territories cannot simply be purchased or claimed by another country against the will of the people living there. But Trump has not let it go. And with this latest letter to Norway's prime minister, the language escalated to a point that alarmed people far beyond the usual political opposition. The specific line about peace, about no longer feeling obligated to think purely of peace, landed like a thunderclap in diplomatic circles. Foreign ministers began making calls. European governments began issuing carefully worded statements. And inside the United States, the people whose job it is to monitor the mental and emotional state of the presidency started speaking publicly in ways they rarely do. Psychiatrists and medical professionals who have studied Trump's behavior over years came forward. They used clinical language. They talked about patterns. They talked about the difference between political aggression, which is normal in any leader, and something that goes beyond the boundaries of rational, stable decision-making. That distinction is at the heart of the 25th Amendment conversation, because the amendment does not exist to remove a president because of unpopular decisions. It exists for a very specific purpose: to protect the nation when the person holding the highest office is no longer capable of fulfilling the duties of that office. The bar is extremely high, the process is extremely difficult, and yet the fact that it is being discussed openly, loudly, and by sitting members of Congress tells a story of its own. Something has shifted in Washington. The tone is different. The urgency is different. And the question of Donald Trump's fitness for office is no longer being whispered, it is being shouted. Here is what the 25th Amendment actually says, in plain language that everyone can understand. If the Vice President and a majority of the Cabinet decide that the President is unable to carry out his duties, they can remove him from power immediately. The Vice President takes over. And if the President pushes back and says he is perfectly fine, Congress then has to vote. And it takes a 2/3 majority in both the House and the Senate to keep him out of office. That is an enormous bar to clear, enormously difficult, which is exactly why it has never been successfully used against any sitting president in American history. But here is what makes this moment different. From every other time the 25th Amendment has been mentioned as a political talking point, this time the people calling for it are not just opposition voices looking for ammunition. This time, the concern is being echoed by independent voices, by medical professionals, by foreign policy experts who have no political axe to grind, but who read that letter to Norway and felt something shift in their understanding of where this presidency is heading. J.D. Vance, the Vice President, has said nothing publicly. The Cabinet has said nothing publicly. And without them, the 25th Amendment goes nowhere. It is a constitutional mechanism, not a political petition. Wanting it to happen and having the power to make it happen are two completely different things. But the conversation itself is the story. Because conversations like this one at this level, with this much urgency, do not simply disappear. They build, they grow, and they force the people who do have the power to act to eventually make a choice. That choice is coming, one way or another. The silence from the White House is speaking louder than any statement could. When a president is accused of being mentally unfit by sitting members of Congress, the normal response is swift and forceful. A press conference, a statement, a parade of allies and supporters pushing back hard and publicly, defending the president's stability and judgment. That has not happened here, not in the way it should. The pushback has been muted. The defense has been thin. And that silence is being noticed by exactly the people who matter most in this situation. The members of the Cabinet who hold the actual constitutional power to act. Trump himself has responded the way he always responds to challenges, with aggression, with counterattacks, with declarations that his enemies are desperate and failing, but the letter exists. The words are on record, and no amount of counter-messaging changes what was written and sent to a foreign leader by the President of the United States. Republican allies on Capitol Hill are in an uncomfortable position. Privately, some of them are saying things that never appear in their public statements. The gap between what is being said behind closed doors and what is being said in front of cameras is wider right now than it has been at any point in this presidency. And that gap is dangerous because gaps like that have a history of closing suddenly, dramatically, and in ways that nobody fully predicted until the moment it happened. Washington is holding its breath and the whole world is watching. Here's where this ends up. The 25th Amendment will not be invoked tomorrow. The votes are not there. The Cabinet is not moving. And Trump is still sitting in the Oval Office, still making decisions, still commanding the most powerful military on earth. But something has changed, something that cannot be unchanged. The conversation has been had publicly, loudly, by people with real power and real credibility. And that conversation leaves a mark on the presidency, on the Republican Party, on the allies watching from abroad, and on the American people who are now asking questions they were not asking 6 months ago. History does not always move in straight lines. Sometimes it stutters, sometimes it stalls, but it always moves. And the events of these past few days have pushed it forward in a direction that nobody can fully predict yet. What is certain is this: the world is different today than it was before that letter was written. Before those words about peace were put on paper and sent to a foreign government. Before elected officials stood up and said out loud what many had only whispered before. The story is not over. It is not even close to over. Stay on this channel, because as this unfolds, this is the place that will bring it to you straight, simple, and without filter. That is the news. and it matters.